The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Marc Barasch. I'm Eileen Cavanaugh from the Hennepin County Library Program Office, and my guest today is the author of The Healing Path, A Soul Approach to Illness. Welcome, Marc.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you on the program
Me too.
today. The Healing Path is a book that tells us that the path to healing is also the path to wholeness, and that wholeness is really the most important thing, whether or not the person is physically healed.
Yeah, this is an idea that I think is really making its way back into our medical system, really pressure from the patients more than anything else, but was really at the root of Western medicine as well as all global medicine. That the idea that really the doctor is a restorer of and retriever of the soul, as well as someone that is a mechanic that sort of fixes the auto body. And that whole notion really fell out of our tradition for a long time, and until holistic medicine began to sort of bring it back in. And I think that I found this for myself, and I spoke to about 40 people in order to do this book who had had serious illnesses and come through unusual recuperations or unexpectedly exceeded their prognoses. And I was struck in virtually every case, they talked about undergoing a journey that was inward, or a psychosocial journey that involved their relationships to everything in their lives, not just sort of finding the right medicine or finding the right doctor. So clearly, illness is more than just the body coming apart. It's really a spiritual detonation of some sort. And in these traditional cultures and tribal cultures, you always see that illness is treated that way. It's treated as an inner event, a spiritual event, a social event, where a lot of the web of life has been broken in many places. Many strands have to be sort of rewoven together in order for somebody to become ill. And I think it's a very wise approach, not because it's necessarily always efficacious. I mean, I don't believe in a lot of the sort of New Age doctrine that's being put out by some people.
No peach pit concentration.
Well, no. I think that sometimes that may be. You know, I mean, there are herbal remedies that what is once alternative medicine sometimes becomes conventional. But I don't think that one can simply sort of do mental exercises and be sure of getting well. It's not really that simple. The body's much more complicated. But I think you can't lose by pursuing a path of wholeness. And very often that path is stimulated by a break in the sort of normal way of going about life. I mean, any kind of crisis will do that, whether it's an auto accident or a disease or a divorce or change in jobs. It's always an opportunity to sort of transform ourselves and begin to bring more of ourselves to bear in our lives. Because very often people find a separation between the way that they're living and the way that they actually feel. I think that can't help but be pathogenic physiologically as well, because you're sort of grinding your gears in one way or another.
You've talked a lot in the book about illness as a sort of point at which people come to wholeness, and indeed I was thinking of mystics like St. Teresa of Avila, for whom sickness was a big part of her life and was preliminary to her becoming a mystic and reforming her order.
Yes, exactly.
And St. John of the Cross, who talks of his dark night of the soul. Which
Carl Jung as well.
And Carl Jung
was ill.
Who
It's
was
extraordinary when you really look into people's lives.
And some of the shamans, excuse me, that you mentioned have said that that they welcomed illness as part of that interior path. What my practical question is, as an ordinary person, is it worth it?
I think there are other ways to pursue, I say this in the book actually, there are other ways to unearth our spiritual riches than digging them out of the flesh with a backhoe. You know, certainly, of course. But I think that there's always, in all spiritual journeys, in any tradition, if you really look at them carefully, there is a descent of some kind. You know, we kind of think of spirituality as like rising, you know, as a kind of this rocket-like trajectory to heaven. Real spiritual journeys aren't like that at all. I mean, very often I think that they're quite dark. You have to pull up from the well of the self. And in fact, the usual image is that the old self has to sort of die. There's a little death of our sort of preconceived self, there's parts of the self that are not really hooked up to the larger principles of life. And that sometimes there's a kind of a clearing of the decks that has to happen. That's what St. John meant by the dark night of the soul. It's a very interesting concept that Catholics call the via negativa. You know, that your process of growth is actually subtractive rather than additive. We think of it all as additive. We're going to get this and get that and go do a weekend on something and collect all these sort of spiritual merit badges. And St. John's idea was actually almost more Buddhist. It was sort of an emptying out of the ideas about reality that really limit us from seeing the larger capital R reality. And I think that a loss of physiological integrity can do that as well. And you see that a lot of, not only does the shaman's journey often begin with a wound, but in mythologies, the story of Bran the Blessed, the great Irish hero, or the Fisher King, or Jacob wrestling the angel, all three of those stories you see a leg wound. And I think the symbolism of that is the legs are what carry us through the world. They enable us to sort of stride through life in a kind of a pretty straight path, and suddenly we can't walk the path we've been walking anymore, and it sort of tends to drive people inward.
It's a forced change in a sense.
It's an enforced change, yeah, exactly. And most change, let's face it, most change is.
We don't change easily on our own.
No, we don't.
You talk about the wounded healer, too, at length in the book. I think of Bernie Siegel, who I believe wrote the introduction to your book, who shaves his head to sort of be at one with the chemotherapy.
That's yes, exactly right. And it's interesting because that wounded healer tradition is very much about that, about empathy with the patient. I mean, James Hillman, the great Jungian psychologist, said that the archetype of the wounded healer has become split, so that it's all the wound is on the patient's side and all healing on the healer's side, and that really this was once much more unified. And in fact, the idea would be that somebody could heal a disease if they themselves had suffered it. In a sense, they knew the way, and so you would experience with a real healer a tremendous sort of empathy and fellow feeling, and an acknowledgement that we're all in this together in some way. And of course, as I say, in tribal cultures, you'll often see the entire tribe saying to the ill person, "We're all in this together." Whereas in our culture, it's a very individual sort of jousting with the devil, you know. And here, it's seen as a collective problem, which, in fact, it is. If you look at the so-called diseases of civilization, they're really collective problems. I mean, we have a certain sort of lifestyle in this society that creates incredible toxic effluents that we eventually eat and inhale and drink, which causes or contributes to causing cancer. So that we go at these diseases, you know, sort of individuals, and great heroic efforts are made, as they should be, to save individuals. But we rarely look at the roots of this in the larger sphere, whereas, as I say, other cultures really had a much more multifactorial view of illness and healing, a view that we're just beginning to come back around to, as evidenced by all these compound words that medicine is cobbling together to biopsychosocial medicine, for example, or psychoneuroimmunology. I mean, they're words that are, in a way, really evidence of how fragmented our approach to medicine has been, and how we have to kind of Lego block it back together.
And there are attempts to pull them back together in some
tremendous
in
right
some
now.
way.
It's an enormous ferment just beneath the surface.
And we seldom think of the fact that, I mean, we think there's a biological root for our illness. We seldom think that there might be personal and sociological roots as well.
Yes, and I think as well is the key phrase there, because otherwise we get into sort of a New Age Calvinism that blames people for being ill and assumes that they have some inner rot or psychological problem or spiritual
and Susan Sontag
Yeah.
wrote her whole book, I think, Metaphors of Illness, on where she railed at the idea that people were somehow personally responsible for their illness.
I think that's a valuable book, although I have to say at one point I had a whole chapter on Susan Sontag that I eventually took out because I take tremendous issue with some of her approach. I mean, she sort of throws the baby out with the bathwater, and perhaps because she had a very grueling course through cancer herself, which she doesn't talk about in the book.
Which has been some years ago, too.
Which is some years ago, and as far as I know, she's fine. But I think that her feeling is extremely personal, obviously, although she doesn't really acknowledge that in the book. And she dismisses a lot of holistic medicine with a couple of flicks of a parenthesis, and says that any idea that there's a psychological contributory factor to illness and healing should be consigned to the she said the backyard of superstition. The barnyard of superstition, which I think is actually a little absurd. I mean, there have been dozens, and actually I would say close to 100 studies at this point on the mind-body connection, and it's real. How strong it is, how contributory it is, or how correlative it is something that still has to be determined. But it can't be really ignored any longer.
And there are lots of examples and stories in your book about people who have used imagery and who have used that mind-body connection to either approach a total healing or a partial healing. I thought it was interesting the various kinds of imagery that you talked about, and one of the things I liked about your book is that it just doesn't talk about imagery as possibly a source of healing, but that various people used various kinds of imagery in different ways. And I was almost wondering as I read your book if well people can't indeed use imagery to
absolutely,
improve their lives.
and we do. I mean, I think we go through our lives subliminally using it. We sort of imagine the world. The world is not, as we know, what we're not seeing the world objectively, so there's always a steady hum of visualization, if you will. But doing it deliberately, I think we all dream, for one thing, and I found that people, when they became ill, really got a lot out of their dreams, and it's something that we might do as a preventative as well, that our dreams are always bringing up the parts of the self that are demanding recognition and the aspects of life we don't want to look at in our waking life. And those aspects we don't want to look at, I think, are things that can eventually contribute to illness. There was an old saying in the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospels of Thomas from the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, that what we don't bring forth within us will make us sick, and what we do bring forth will heal us. Dreams are sort of a way of bringing forth. They're a sort of a subsuming of normal consciousness and a rising of the deeper sources, well springs of the self and selfhood and the evolving self. And I think that in visualization, it's sort of a similar proposition. I mean, very often you hear about visualization exercises that are very directed, that will, imagine your white cells doing this and your red cells doing that.
And the Pac-Man eating.
The Pac-Man, there is some evidence. I mean, there really have been some very, very interesting studies that seem to show that these visualizations can have very specific effects on the body. Just like if you imagine putting your hand over a fire, let's say, your hand will generally measurably heat up. If you imagine biting into a lemon, you'll salivate. I mean, the very clear relationships between imagery and physiology. But I also found that when people went on these healing journeys and followed what I call the healing path, that the images went to sit still. They weren't just sort of inert and sort of subservient, but they began to behave more like genuine objects and subjects of the psyche. They would begin to sort of talk back. And people found that these, the Pac-Man imagery would sort of run out after a while, and they would begin to get more authentic imagery, more personalized imagery. You can't prescribe these sort of things. You can start maybe with something that you've read in a book, but most people found eventually that the journey had a lot to do with individuation, and the images similarly individuated, and they just did all sorts of things. I mean, one guy, for example. He had been told to imagine, giant, German shepherds, I guess, savage animals eating up these horrible cancer cells, and he really didn't like it. He just didn't relate to that imagery, and he was trying to do his visualization. And one day he thought of mice, and field mice, and he thought the cancer cells were brown field mice, and the white cells were white field mice. And somehow the white field mice just chased the brown field mice out. And it's very interesting because it showed, sort of on a physiological level, just intuitively, he sensed that the cancer cells they're still our cells. I mean, they're changed, they're colored differently, so to speak. They behave differently, but they're not alien creatures, And he remembered that in his childhood, he couldn't figure out where the image had come from. Then he remembered that his father used to bring white mice home because they had a house that was infested with brown field mice. And the white mice would do exactly that. They would chase out the brown field mice. Another patient also who decided that his path of healing had to be sort of a path of peace and reconciliation, and here he would go home every day and he would imagine this incredible carnage of, he was told to imagine knights spearing dragons or something and blood spurting everywhere, and he just didn't like it, and it got him upset, and it probably increased the level of cortisol and other chemicals in his body that are not conducive to healing. So he would imagine this sort of spiritual Pepto-Bismol would come down from heaven and sort of coat his insides, and you really find wonderful drawings and visualizations that people come up with on their own, and I think that's the key to healing is extremely individual. You know, it has to be what heals us, what makes us feel most alive. On an emotional level, it's the same thing. For some people, it might be rage. For some people, it might be love. I mean, it's not something you can really mandate.
And I think that's an important facet of your book that allows people to understand that it's not just a packaged thing that you can go out and use somebody else's imagery necessarily that will help for you.
Yeah, it gets almost as pat as, I mean, people critique conventional
medicine. It's kind of like
medicine.
taking a pill, you know?
Yeah, they say, right, taking a pill is incredibly standardized. Well, we can't standardize this other thing either. I mean, we really have to tailor it.
Well, you know, maybe it's born from the fact that I think American people are so used to going to the doctor and getting that magic pill that is going to cure them pretty instantly. I think that's the expectation of a lot of us. So one of my questions about that is, how can people sort of be educated away from that? It seems like that's an ingrained feeling for many of us who have partnered with the medical.
Yeah. Well, I think people are kind of voting with their feet, first of all. I mean, alternative medicine, which sometimes can also be just getting a pill, so I don't want to say that's necessarily always the healing path, but it's just interesting that there are $12+ billion spent out of pocket on alternative medicines, and about 10-something spent, 10 billion plus on hospitalization out of pocket now. This was a real shock when this statistic came out. It was done by a doctor at Harvard. So clearly people are doing this, pursuing these other paths regardless of what they've been told and how they've been raised and what their assumptions have been. But I think that the need really is to be able to see illness in the context of a life, you know, and that takes time. It can't be something you can't, you know, and I think very often we don't want to see that. So we will go in, for example, a cold, something very simple. We have an incredible level of suppressant strategies, you know, to suppress the symptoms of a cold. So the idea is we notice the sniffles and we go and get some kind of decongestant and we go on with our lives. Therefore, no journey has been taken. We don't ever look at why did we get a cold? Have we been working too hard? Or have we been emotionally upset that affects the immune system? Is there something in our lifestyle? Is somebody a smoker? Are they eating badly? Typically, if you take a more holistic approach, you won't take these suppressant medications. Unfortunately, the whole system doesn't help in that case because you're not supposed to miss days of work and the like, and we all have to make a living. But when it's possible, when people take this other approach and decide, well, instead of just fighting the symptoms, I'd rather build up the basic tonus of the body and mind, the basic health of my life, then you don't just heal the cold, you heal your life. You know, you maybe take a couple of days and lay in bed and read and nurture yourself in certain ways that you haven't been nurturing yourself. And in that nurturance, you might have thoughts you haven't thought for a while and feelings you haven't felt for a while. And all sorts of ripple effects might come out of something as simple as treating a cold as part of the healing path. And this is even more true with the larger elements and more serious elements. That the neurologist Oliver Sacks once said, our diseases are ours as much as our faces. That we have to really sort of own this experience and incorporate it into the fabric of our life, not just to sort of put it off to the side and instantly get rid of it, although it's very understandable that people do not want to suffer, you know. But I think that we live in what Ivan Illich calls an anesthetic culture. You know, we don't believe that suffering should exist, and I'm a practicing Buddhist myself, and the Buddhists sort of, what appealed to me when I first was encountering these ideas was they sort of started off with the fact that life doesn't work. Things, I mean, it can work sometimes, and it works a lot of the time maybe for some of us, but things fall apart at one point or another. And the real, sort of nut meat of spirituality is how do we deal with those moments, and how do we actually utilize them to allow sort of the chrysalis of outmoded conceptions fall away.
I wanted to talk a little bit, since we're speaking here in early January of 1995, right after the holidays. You use Scrooge as a sort of metaphor for the healing process. Tell us, sort of run a parallel.
Yeah, well, actually, I'd like to run a parallel with the story of Job, because I think really it's a retelling of that story. I mean, these are our sort of archetypal myths and narratives in this culture. I'll start with Scrooge, actually, because it was where I started. I had cancer myself, and in the midst of the kind of most confusing time, I had been having these very vivid dreams, and I happened to turn on the television around Christmas time, and there was Scrooge having these very vivid dreams, and I really identified with it. I mean, most of us don't identify with Scrooge. I mean, he's kind of this terrible character, and but I thought, God, this is a lot like me. I mean, which Scrooge in contemporary parlance would be kind of a workaholic. Which I was at the time. I was editing a New Age journal. I was really working 20-hour days. I was very determined to make a success of it, and was kind of ignoring everything else in my life and the people in my life. And eventually, something has to give. And in my case, as much as Scrooge's, it was these very vivid nightmares that were saying, look, you can't go on any further the way you've been going. And in fact, at what point, I think it's in the book, not in the film, but Scrooge asks one of the spirits, why have you come? And the spirit said, for your reclamation. And I was sort of getting the same message. I mean, I'm not saying that illness was some sort of benign or divine condition, but it definitely sort of couched itself as it began to announce itself in these dreams, or sort of herald its presence as something that was going to create an enormous change in my life, not just in my body. So if you look at the story of Scrooge, just as the story of Job, these are classic shamanic tales of the being wrenched from ordinary life, being plunged into the inner world, having social connections sundered, finding oneself sort of alone, and having to, from a very humbled position, encounter something larger than the ordinary self, and then returning to the world and returning changed. You return to the same place. It is circular, but it's not a full circle.
It's spiral path.
It's a spiral path, exactly, as I think life continually is. I mean, like William Blake once said, man is born a specter and requires a new self constantly. That's the path of life. I mean, that there's always this molting. And it's interesting because in the story of Job, it's really a psychoneuroimmunologic fable in some ways. I mean, Job, their understanding of how a person becomes ill is expressed all throughout Middle Eastern mythology, because I studied other mythologies as well, is that Job is this sort of king in the land of Uz, and he loses his children, he loses his flocks as part of this kind of celestial bet between God and Satan. And what is said in the Bible is that God deserts him and allows Satan to touch his flesh. It's very much how we understand the way the immune system works. And there's been a number of studies that have indicated that people often have very severe emotional traumas and losses, maybe 18 months before the tumor shows up. In Job's case, it's a skin disease, basically, boils. But it speaks of an idea of loss of immunity. In other words, it's not that God has to desert Job before he can be touched by illness, and that desertion seems to come after these traumas in his life. This was, as I said, considered throughout the Middle East to be the way that people got sick. They would say that your spirits deserted you, and therefore the demons could afflict you.
Leaves a void.
It leaves a void. It's a sort of, we would call it a lowered immune competence. And then Job has to start out on this journey, and he can't go into the temple any longer, into the outer temple, because he has boils, and that was considered a sign of uncleanness. So he has to sort of go to the inner temple. His friends are no help, which is something I often
with friends like that.
Yeah,
yes.
and friends like that. You know, one friend accuses him of, he says, God, now I'm having nightmares too, you know, because I was going to say Scrooge, Job cries out at one point in the story, with dreams upon my bed thou affrightest me, very much the way Scrooge sort of cries out at different points, and I found myself crying out during my own journey. But so he's sort of, you know, he's having these terrible nightmares. His friends are accusing him of giving them nightmares, or just giving him these sort of biblical era Hallmark cards that, you know, just have faith and everything will be fine. And, you know, and he, at one point he says, you know, leave off your ashy maxims. You know, I just don't want to hear any more of this. And he finally finds himself, as St. John says, you know, abandoned on a dung heap. And St. John says it's only then that God deigned to speak to him. But the God that speaks to him is a God of sort of this wider reality. You know, I am the God that placed Leviathan in the seas, and you know, the God of the rain and weather and nature. And it's a very kind of non-anthropomorphic sort of experience of kind of, there is a much bigger reality, you know, much wider reality. It's something that I think Scrooge also has to go through, and he goes through his own pasts, and he sees that he's more than he thought he was. He finds this child, kind of an inner child experience, and again, our common pop psych parlance.
And in both cases, we see the better person emerging.
In the end, exactly. And that's there was a lame deer, the Indian shaman once said that. He said that, you know, you white folks don't understand that very often a person can come out of an illness as more whole, you know, not necessarily cured. And that's interesting as well. I mean, that healing and curing are not always synonymous. This is not a facile sort of formula, but we never lose by, you know, if we approach the task of wholeness sincerely. It becomes sort of the vehicle to a more meaningful life, whether we're in one piece or not.
In the few seconds that we have left, I want to give you just a little time to talk about your new book, which will be out in March of 1995, called Remarkable Recovery.
This is a book I did with a woman named Carol Hirschberg. It's actually the only book I've ever written in collaboration, and it was a wonderful experience, unusually so. And she was one of the world's experts on spontaneous remission, had compiled a lot of medical case studies. And we sort of combined our approaches, I as a sort of writer and journalist, and she as a researcher, to begin to look into what it was about these cases. We tracked some of the cases down from the medical literature, which had never been done, and asked people, who are you? How did this occur? What was your life like? What was your inner life like? Your social life? What did you eat? Trying to see if we could find what the mechanisms of what we call the healing system might be. And it's quite a long and involved book, and I couldn't really do it justice now, but it was an incredibly interesting project for both of us, and I think we turned up some pretty unique information.
Marc, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having
We'll
me.
look forward to Remarkable Recovery and also The Healing Path.
Thanks.
Thank you.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.